Hello, I am back and I am going to read over the King George V's pastime in sports. The recording didn't go over very well when I was listening to it yesterday, and it was a 50-minute read, and I just was not satisfied with the quality of the sound. So I'm praying and hoping that today it will go better. But I am reading to you to make sure the sound gets a little bit better, and I just want to show you a little espresso cup that I picked up on one of my trips. It's called Never, Never, Never Give Up. It's one of Winston Churchill's mantras during World War II. He was not well liked by King George V. He was not that fond of him, and that was a different time for Winston Churchill, if you go read through his history. But as we all know, he became well loved by King George VI. He was beloved by the people during that time. And his oratory, positive speeches were a great help to England and the people. But this is on King George V. And this book is written by Kenneth Rose. And I picked this book up off of a website called thriftbook.com. And as you can see, the paperback is $5.59. Hardcover is $8.99. So it's a really good read. And when you look through here, you see that Kenneth Rose has proved himself to be a very able biographer of his account of the early years of Curzon. The book cements his reputation. It's sympathetic but not uncritical. So he does provide a very good picture of George V. Um, he he presents his human side as a father, as a monarch. He presents his human side when it comes to loving the people of England and trying to honor their wishes. He was a very, very dutiful king and monarch and sovereign, and he followed the patterns of his grandmother, Queen Victoria. He served 25 years. He's not really a well noticed king. For some people of today, they often think of King George VI, but they don't think about King George V, which is why I'm reading about him. Um, and I encourage people to read about him or even watch a documentary. And I'm going to show you a documentary that's really, really good. And if you can just follow this channel. This here is called The People Profile, King George V, founder of the House of Windsor documentary. It is an hour and 10 minutes, but it is, in my opinion, a very exceptional documentary. Um, and I really think the visuals on this are really good. Here's his stamp that he purchased. He's known for purchasing that rare stamp for 1,450 pounds. But when you look through the documentary, you'll see the overall issues and that he had to deal with. And he was a monarch, he was a sovereign, but he had very little say so. You know, he was a constitutional monarch and he had very little say so in things. And so there were a lot of issues going on with in changing times, legitimate changing times, with socialism and fascism and conservatism and liberalism, progressiveness, which some of those progressive issues needed to be brought to light, but there was a lot going on during his monarchy, and he was a very dutiful, dutiful king, and I have a fondness for him. But has a complexity when it comes to his parentage being very stern, and he might be He had a very set in his ways. So, but we're going to read about his pastimes. Okay, and in his pastimes, he really enjoyed horses and hunting. He enjoyed his time at Sandringham Castle, and it's a long chapter, but it's a good chapter, and that's why I wanted to read it over again. So join me as I read about it, and let's hope the sound is a lot better today. The king liked a book with a plot, a tune he could hum, and a picture that told a story. Such simple tastes evoke the disdain of the sophisticated, who contrast the artistic munificence of Charles I and George IV with the supposed Philistinism of late sovereigns. Although the two paragons, one lost both to his throne and his head, and the other ever a shred of kingly virtue. Some of these discontented aesthetes reproach a successful generation of the royal family with little whinnies of despair. Others more courtly resort to that literary device known as meiosis or litotes, the expression of an opinion by denying the contrary. Thus, one historian of the Victorian age has written, it would be an exaggeration to say the authorship enjoyed any special consideration at royal court. The interest which the Queen took in the literature of the day was not particularly extensive. And Sir Theodore Martin, hagiographer of the Prince Consort, wrote of Queen Victoria's etchings. Of them, it is enough to say that the drawing is not remarkable, and that, as etchings, the difficulties of the art have not been overcome. Such impeachments are sometimes just, and sometimes not. Queen Victoria, as it happened, read Cornwallis on the Sacrament and Gizots on the Revolution d'Angleterre, while her hair was being done, filled album after album with charming watercolor sketches, and sang to Mendelssohn, the composer, with only a very occasional false note. King Edward VII, it is true, was too restless a temperament to settle down to a good book. In unfamiliar atmosphere of a literary dinner, he once inquired about the qualifications of a fellow guest. An authority on Lamb, he was told. The king, who believed that there was a time and place for everything, explained incredulously, an authority on what, Lamb? Yet it was he who established the Order of Merit. It's a reward that most distinguished minds in the kingdom. And it was a award he had in mind for the most distinguished minds in the kingdom. And his advice to an aspiring man of letters recognized both the pursuits of learning and the realities of life. Stick to Shakespeare, Mr. Lee. There's money in Shakespeare. Sidney Lee, however, thought he knew better and produced a 2-volume life of King Edward VII. King George V's approach to literature was respectful without being reverent. He had scarcely reigned 1 month when Asquith's private secretary telephoned the palace on Thomas Hardy's 70th birthday to suggest that a telegram to old Hardy might be appreciated. It shall be done, came the reply, and Mr. Hardy of Alnwick, who had made the king's fishing rods, was astonished to receive royal congratulations on attaining an age he had not attained, on a day which was the anniversary of nothing. 3 years later, on the death of Alfred Austin, the king proposed that the office of Poet Laureate be allowed to lapse. Only when Asquith pressed for the appointment of Robert Bridges did he change his mind. In spite of these misadventures, the king was neither indifferent to the repute of authors nor ignorant of their works. He took much care in selecting candidates for the Order of Merit, including both Hardy and Bridges, and he would have bestowed it on Kipling, Shaw, and Houseman had not all three of them refused. From 1890 until the end of his life, he kept a reading list which shows that, on average, he had read one book a week. Since he had to spend some hours of each day perusing official documents on one sort or another, as well as the Times, that is the remarkable achievements for a man who devoted much of his leisure to country pursuits. He enjoyed new novels as they appeared: John Buchan, Gilbert Franco, A.E.W. Mason, and C.S. Forester, and even Ernest Hemingway. Even with many expressions of disapproval and expurgated edition of Lady Chatterley's Lovers imported into Balmoral by a lady-in-waiting of liberal views. He also heard shouting with laughter over Some People by Harold Nicolson. Mostly, the king read memoirs and biographies, his comments echoing the sentiments of an earlier sailor king, William IV. I know no person so perfectly disagreeable and even dangerous as an author. He displayed an angry contempt for those who abused the confidences of friends or the trust of an official position in return for money. Miss Asquith's autobiography, published in 1920, provoked a particular storm. The king, who kept me for nearly an hour, Curzon wrote to his wife, let fly about Margot. He severely condemns Asquith for not reading and Crewe for reading and passing her scandalous chatter. He was shocked, too, when Sir Almeric Fitzroy, soon after his retirement as Clerk of the Privy Council, published two thick volumes describing the author's private conversations with ministers and others over a quarter of a century. It was the temptation of the office. Queen Victoria had been similarly outraged by the memoirs of Charles Greville, Clerk of the Privy Council from 1821 to 1859, and his editor, Henry Reeve, was denied the knighthood that would otherwise have come to him as a registrar of the council's judicial community. The king regretted the spate of contentious memoirs and diaries of the post-war era, in which warriors and others refought their battles. He denounced Colonel Charles A. Court Repington, the military correspondent of the Times. He said he was a cad and a blackguard. He reprimanded Field Marshal French for reviving angry disputes and personal wranglings. He declared himself disgusted by Admiral Bacon's book on the Jutland. He nevertheless may himself hankered after the fame and more material rewards of authorship. When Haig had told him that he had been offered £100,000 for his memoirs, the king replied, "Yes, and I expect they would offer me £1,000,000. He also said to Baldwin that he could, if he chose, relate the most extraordinary things that he had been told him by other ministers. I hope, Sir Baldwin replied, that you will not write autobiographical articles in the press. The king said, "Not till I'm broke." Any breach of confidence which touched his own family was certain to incur disfavor. There was, for instance, the curious episode of Sir Frederick Ponsonby and the Empress Frederick. Soon after the accession of Edward VII in 1901, Ponsonby had accompanied him to Friedrichshafen, where his sister, the Empress, lay dying of cancer. During the visit, the Empress sent for Ponsonby and asked him to take back to England with him the many letters which she had written to her mother, Queen Victoria. These had been returned to her from Windsor after the Queen's death earlier that year. But as they contained political indiscretions, she wanted them removed from the reach of her son, Emperor William, before her approaching death. Ponsonby promised to meet her wishes, and before traveling back to London with the king, he quietly added to 2 large boxes of letters to his own baggage. What remains extraordinary is that he did not then deposit them into the royal archives at Windsor, but instead he kept them in his own custody for the next 26 years. In 1927, Ponsonby decided to edit and publish a selection of the letters, although it was far from certain that he was legally entitled to the copyright. With some plausibility, however, he argued that it was the Empress that had not intended for him to publish them. She would have taken the simpler course in 1901 of giving them to her brother, King Edward. Although King George V was doubtful about Ponsonby's plan, he did not forbid it. The book appeared in 1928, provoking controversy in both England and Germany, as well as threats of legal action for breach of copyright from exiled Kaiser. The king first seemed interested in the book, Ponsonby later wrote, but then his sister, the Princess Victoria, denounced it as one of the most dreadful books ever published. He joined in the general abuse of it. So much unwelcome publicity cannot have increased the king's confidence in his high-handed keeper of the privy purse. As the guardian of his grandmother's reputation, the king erupted with rage at the flippancy of Linton Saintric's Queen Victoria, which appeared in 1921. Yet when the final volumes of Moneypenny and Buckle's Life of Disraeli were submitted to him before publication, he proved the most reasonable of censors. His sole doubt concerned Disraeli's reference to Queen Victoria as the fairy. And when Rosebery pleaded that Disraeli had meant to disrespect but also borrowed a romantic image from Spenser's Fairy Queen, the king gave way. The king had been right to suspect gentle mockery in Disraeli's use of the phrase, and his refusal to veto it was therefore all the more enlightened. He showed the same tolerance on being asked whether he minded a remark of Gladstone's that was to appear in Crewe's Life of Rosebery. The Queen alone is enough to kill any man. He himself could speak with much authority on this matter, as any of his grandmother's strength and will. He did not resist it 40 years earlier. He would now be reigning as King Albert I. Okay, I'm just going to do a quick sound check. So if just pause a minute. Sir Theodore Martin, hagiographer of the Prince Consort, to suggest that a telegram to Old Hardy. Okay. All right, the sound seems pretty good, so I'm going to keep going. So I will continue. Of all the volumes which passed through the king's hands, none brought him more pleasure than his stamp albums. He claimed that they had saved his life during the war by providing complete relaxation from affairs of state. In peacetime, he tried to spend 3 afternoons each week looking at his collection under the guidance of Sir Edward Bacon, the curator. The king enjoyed his company, and on learning that he suffered from a weak chest, bought him a fur-lined coat with astrakhan collar to keep out the cold during his journeys between Croydon and the palace. See, the King George V is very thoughtful. Godfrey Fawcett, his naval equerry, had also took up the pastime, and the two old shipmates would exchange philatelic gossip. The king wrote to him in 1921, "Glad you got a lot of stamps so cheap at the auction. Look out that you don't get ruined. Did you see that last week a pair of 2-cent British guinea on an envelope in Paris fetched £5,250, and one Hawaiian 2-cent used fetched £3,894. Wonderful!" The king especially and personally approved all new designs for stamps in Great Britain and the Crown Colonies. Only once did he fail to have his way. It was when the Inland Revenue determined to bring the stamp printing monopoly of De La Rue to an end and divide it between De La Rue and Harrison. Although Harrison were hereditary printers to the sovereign, they lacked the experience of their rivals in producing stamps. "Make me look like a stuffed monkey, don't they?" the king said of Harrison's first efforts, blurred and indelicate. The issue nevertheless went into circulation for a year before being replaced by a finer engraving. It is due to the king's perceptive eye that the traditions of elegant, austere design continued throughout his reign, and for a generation and beyond. Although briefly broken by an ornate issue to mark the British Empire exhibition of 1924, towards the end of his life he begged Sir Kenneth Clark, the surveyor of the king's pictures, to discourage fancy issues of stamps, as if Great Britain were some ridiculous place like San Marino. Clark, even then the guardian of civilized values, gladly gave his promise. 30 years later, when he had become chairman of the Postage Stamp Advisory Committee, a new Postmaster General, Anthony Wedgwood Ben, informed Clark that he intended to make frequent issues of illustrative stamps. "I told him," Clark wrote, "that I could not agree with this and offered to resign, an offer that was almost gladly accepted. Then I told him the story of King George V. He thought I must be a little mad." The Prince Consort surprised me exceedingly by his intimate knowledge of what I might call the conduct of a picture. Frith wrote after exhibiting his Derby Day at the Royal Academy in 1858. "He told me why I had done certain things and how, if a certain change had been made, my object would have been assisted. How the masses of light and shade might still be more evenly balanced, and so how some parts of the picture might receive still more completion. I put many of the prince's suggestions to the proof after the close of the exhibition, and I improved my picture in every instance. King George V did not inherit his grandfather's analytic eye. Although Frith Ramsgate Sands, exhibiting 4 years earlier than Derby Day, bought by Queen Victoria, was one of his favorite pictures. He hung it in the private compartments at Buckingham Palace, together with the work of other trusted contemporaries such as Landseer and Winterhalter, Grant and Phillips. He was particularly attached to Meissonier's undemanding narrative piece, The Brawl. Over the years, there's been well-bred comments on the man who inherited the finest private collections in the world, and they should have been surrounded himself with masters of lesser rank. But then it was he who had to live with them. The king was nevertheless a proud and possessive trustee of his heritage. During a visit to the National Gallery, he bullied a hesitant Sir Kenneth Clark into becoming survey of the king's pictures. The reluctant courtier later described their conversation. "Why won't you come work for me?" "Because I wouldn't have time to do the job properly." "What is there to do?" "Well, sir, the pictures need looking after." "There's nothing wrong with them," the king says, "and the people write letters asking for more information about them. Don't answer them. I want you to take the job." What Clark had feared had come to pass. At the Queen's behest, he found himself immersed more in the family history of the House of Hanover than in the care and study of the splendid collection in his charge. It has sometimes been suggested that the Queen was on an altogether higher aesthetic plane than her husband. She had chosen fields of interest like royal iconography, particularly that of the descendant of George III and Queen Charlotte, furniture and the miniatures from the dollhouse to the trinkets of Fabergé. She was a dedicated researcher, annotator, and labeler. But in all her life, she never bought a really good or important picture. She never patronized the most imaginative artists of her day. Even in scholarship, she lacked humility. When told that the little group of Frederick, Prince of Wales, was playing the cello to his sisters was by Philip Mercier, she replied imperiously, "We prefer the picture to remain as by the Nolkens." I was uh, It was always a memorable day when the king visited an exhibition. At the opening of the Tate Gallery extension, he stood before the French Impressionists and called out to the Queen, "Here's something to make you laugh, May." In the National Gallery, he shook his stick at a Cezanne, and in another room, confided to the director, "I tell you what, Turner was mad. My grandmother always said so." The Royal Academy's cautious experiment provoked him to write, "I never saw a worse lot of pictures." Modern art is becoming awful, I think. And when required to sign Augustus John's diploma at the Royal Academician, he explained, "What, that fellow? I've a dad good mind not to sign it." Even the sight of a classroom, of a schoolgirl's painting of a flower arrangement, aroused his suspicion. He would look at it and he'd say, "Isn't that useless?" he asked Education Minister. "It trains the powers of observation," H.L.A.L. Fisher replied. The king would concede, "Well, perhaps." It was, after all, the sort of argument used to justify stamp collecting, that and his interest in geography. The king's instinctive dislike of modern painting was reinforced by the treatment he received at the hands of leading artists. Charles Sims, chosen to paint an official portrait, gave his sovereign the elegant stance of another century. The king complained that it turned out his toes and made him look like a ballet dancer, and he ordered it to be destroyed. The canvas was burned on the premises of the Royal Academy. Oswald Burley's portrait, the hands of which similarly failed to please, suffered a gentler fate. It was merely hung behind a door. He was well content, however, with John Lavery's conversation piece of the king and queen and their two eldest children, now in the National Portrait Gallery. When viewing the work in the artist's studio, the king said he would like to have a hand in it and was allowed to add a touch of blue to the garter ribbon. The queen followed suit. It pleased Lavery to recall that Velázquez, when painting Philip IV of Spain, had permitted the king to add the red cross of the Knight of Calatrava to his portrait. Many a work was written off in the royal eyes because the artist had failed to show a concern for the correct display of military accoutrements and decorations. At St. Paul's Cathedral in 1931, the king observed to Dean Ing that the sculptor of the Kitchener Memorial bust had put his garter star too near the middle of his chest. Yet the king himself did not always despise artistic license. After Norman Wilkinson had painted a picture of the royal yacht Britannia in the Solent, he agreed that it was an accurate depiction of the royal yacht Britannia. He agreed that it was inaccurate in every detail, but asked whether the artist would remove the buoy and a little near the vessel, so the Britannia would appear to be making a tighter and more seaman-like turn. Wilkinson agreed. The king also brought his practical mind to bear on a wider problem. In 1921, Stamford wrote on his behalf to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The king asked if, when you are considering possible new forms of taxation, it has occurred to you that a tax might be put upon works of art which leave this country. It would have the double effect of bringing money, through perhaps only a small amount, into the revenue, and perhaps a process which, if persisted in, will gradually result in denuding these islands of some of their most priceless artistic possessions. The vast purchasing power of the United States had already lured many privately owned treasures across the Atlantic, and it was perceptive of the king to suggest how sales might be discouraged. Ultimately, however, the method adopted by successive British governments depended on licensing rather than deterring taxation. Okay, I need a bit of a refresher. I have my brown teapot, my brown British teapot, and I'm drinking from it. And I'm drinking PG Tips. So, cheers. Went to the Covent Garden and saw Fidelio, the king wrote in his diary, and dull it was. That same year, he heard The Merry Widow 4 times, and A Monastery Garden, Rosemarie, Tea for Two, No, No, Nanette. These were melodies that brought him most pleasure, although the lighter classical repertoire was not included. He is quite wonderful, the king said of the violinist Kubelik after a recital at Sandringham in his father's day. But I wish he didn't have long hair. A typical evening program on the gramophone was Caruso singing Handel's Largo, followed by Hallelujah chorus, and ending with a record of The Aldershot Military Tattoo. The king deplored most musical innovations, from American jazz to the operas of Richard Strauss. During the interlude that occurs in the ceremony of changing the guard at Buckingham Palace, the band of the Grenadier Guards, after months of practice, one morning played extracts from Electra. But the king preferred Johann Strauss. He sent out a message to the bandmaster. His Majesty does not know what the band has just played, but it is never to be played again. It was nevertheless at the king's personal request that Deleuze was made a Companion of Honors in 1929. Another well-worn record to be played after dinner was entitled The Departure of the Troopship, a sentimental yet stirring piece. It ended with the national anthem, at which everybody in the drawing room, including the king and the queen, rose to their feet. It was among their favorite tunes, and George Plank, invited to decorate the ceiling of the king's bedroom in the queen's dollhouse, did no wrong in painting a pergola of roses in which the flowers reflected the musical notation of God Save the King. Some renderings displeased him. I do wish that the musicians would not play it so quickly, he complained to Sir Landon Ronald at the Albert Hall. They hurry it through as though they want to get it over with. And to me, it means a great deal, and I look upon it almost as a hymn. Ronald explained that King Edward had always urged him to hurry it up. Okay, we're on to the stage and theater. The king's patronage of the stage evaded the higher drama. Saw King Lear, he wrote as a young man, but did not care about it. And it was only at the age of 77 that Queen Mary, with her superior education, watched a performance of Hamlet for the first time. Curiosity drew them both to The Miracle, in which the Duke of Rutland's daughter achieved a tour de force in her silent role. But Lady Diana Cooper's laurels wilted when the king summoned her to the royal box and said, "Of course you got no words to learn or say. That's half the battle." As in previous reigns, an entire theatrical company was sometimes invited to Balmoral. The king enjoyed the actors' green room repertoire every bit as much as the comedies they presented. "It is true that you once had a dress in a pigsty?" he asked, a member of a small traveling company. Yes, sir," was the reply, "but I think they were pedigree pigs." The cinema. The cinema became a relaxation, almost an addiction, of his later years. He enjoyed such popular films as The Scarlet Pimpernel. For his wife's sake, she forbade anything immodest or suggestive. The king imposed a more surprising prohibition. He did not want to be shown descriptive documentaries about his empire, of which, he said, he'd heard and he saw quite enough in other ways. Anything about ships touched his heart, but again, there were exceptions. He personally rebuked the headmaster at Eton for having allowed the battleship Potemkin to be shown there. Claude Elliott pleaded that it was good for the boys to see the new film techniques, even if they did not come from the Soviet Russia. Nonsense, the king replied. It is certainly not good for the boys to witness mutinies, especially naval mutinies. Some of the king's subjects, they were doubtlessly disappointed by their sovereign's near indifference to the fine arts. Many more were heartened by his patronage of sport. When Lord Brabourne, the governor of Bombay, bought a racehorse to run at local meetings, Wigram told him, "The king feels sure that a governor who takes part in the joys of life will be much more at home with the people in his province." The racehorse course was one of the few public places where the king was seen to laugh, perhaps the first indication that he was his father's son. Okay, I'm going to pause a minute here. Queen Elizabeth II was also known to love her horse races and her horses, so it must be into the DNA. On the subject of horse racing, it was a family divided. King Edward, 3 times the winner of the Derby, had no cause to discourage his children. Queen Victoria, by contrast, sent her grandson this doleful warning on his 20th birthday, and she wrote, "As for betting or anything of that kind, no end of young or older men have been ruined, or parents' hearts broken, and great names and titles dragged into the dirt." Sure enough, there was the scandal of Prince Francis of Teck, who gambled debt of £10,000 on a single race at the Curragh his brother-in-law reluctantly helped to settle. On the death of King Edward, many feared that the new sovereign would either disperse or reduce the royal stable. He did neither. He prompted as much by economics as by sentiment. His father had established himself as one of the most successful owners and breeders of his generation. Over the years, he won £146,128 in stakes. He received £269,495 in fees from the stallions and £77,000 from the sales. It's a total of almost £500,000 in the days when each was worth a golden sovereign. Although considered by the most royal trainer, Richard Marsh, to be a better and more informed judge of a horse than his father, King George was consistently an unlucky owner. He won a classic racehorse at his 24th attempt, when in 1928 his bay filly Scuttle took the 1,000 guineas. Yet he was never heard to blame either trainer or jockey for the poor performance of a horse. He endured a distressing episode at the Derby of 1913. As the field wept round Tattenham Corner, a brave but misguided suffragette sacrificed her life in deliberately bringing down the king's colt, called Anmer, after the village of the Sandringham estate. To add to his vexation, on the following morning he received this note from an equerry: "Inquiries are being made as to whether your Majesty is going to wear a tall hat at Epsom today." The king wrote angrily at the bottom of the sheet, "Who are the damn fools? A tall hat is always worn at this meeting at Epsom." Denied the greater prizes of racing, the king nevertheless enjoyed its camaraderie. He followed his father's custom of giving a Derby Day dinner at Buckingham Palace to members of the Jockey Club. Another annual event was the house party at Windsor Castle for Ascot races. Whenever he had a winner, each woman guest at dinner received a brooch bearing his racing colors of purple, scarlet, and gold. There were few such favors for the irreverent Nancy Astor. "You really are becoming too grand for words," she told the Duke of Roxborough at Ascot one year, "never leaving the royal stand. You might just as well be the court dentist." To the king's subsequent delight, Roxborough retorted, "If I ever have to pull out the king's teeth, I shall certainly come to you for the gas." The king also enjoyed his visits to the Duke of Richmond for Goodwood races, and sometimes to Lord Derby for the Grand National. The Duke was but a liberal host, used to celebrate the departure of his royal guests by dining off plain boiled beef and carrots. One year, his son persuaded the family butler, Mr. Marshall, to wear a pedometer through a single day in a race week. It was seen that it was registered 19 and a half miles. The king's visits to both Knowlesby and Goodwood in 1924 were complicated by the intrusion of state business. At each, he was required to hold a privy council before racing began. In March, to authorize emergency powers in the event of expected transport strike. Of an expected transport strike. In July, to confirm an adjustment to the boundary between Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State. A Goodwood a year later, when an impending coal strike demanded yet another sudden meeting of the Privy Council, the king suggested that it could again be held in his host's drawing room. But the priggish Home Secretary, Sir William Johnson Hicks, thought that the country might be shocked by such supposed frivolity. The king thus felt obliged to cut short his racing and return to London. "Just my luck," he wrote in his diary. By the end of his reign, he had grown bolder. When Baldwin became the prime minister for the third time, the king told him that he hoped that the cabinet reconstruction would be complete before the 1st of July meeting at the Newmarket. Okay, I know he had... Let me just X out of this. Okay, this is something I wanted to talk about. The King George V sports and pastimes. Okay. He was known for his sport pursuits, leisure activities, particularly his passion for shooting and stamp collecting. He was an avid and skilled shooter. He enjoyed his stamp collecting, we know that. For tennis and golf, while not his primary interest, King George V did enjoy tennis and was even a member of the royal family, the only member of the royal family to play at the Wimbledon Championships. He also enjoyed other activities like riding, fishing, cricket, sailing, and rowing. His naval career and travels also shaped his interests in the open air and physical pursuits. Okay, so let's click on that. There's a lot of places, it looks like, in England that are named after King George V. So, he really did enjoy his sports, his horses, all of that, which was, that was his thing. I think Prince Henry or was the Duke of Gloucester. Um, the current Duke of Gloucester, Prince Richard, his father also was more sports oriented, like King George V. So we'll read more about that. Let's see if I can. We're just about done. As a gambler, however, his confidence seemed to wane with the years. He laid £300 on Lenberg to win. He wrote of the Goodwood meeting in 1909. It came off. The following year, in a handicap at Epsom, he risked $100 each way on his father's Derby winner, Manure, and lost the lot. Yet in 1924, he put no more than £1 on Master Robert, who won the Grand National at 25 to 1. It must have been a larger bet, which led him to record the defeat of Scuttle in the Oaks of 1928. We return home wiser, but certainly poorer, he stated. In common with most desultory punters, the king is unlikely to have shown a profit from the season to season, but he clung to the comforting illusion that his winnings were copious enough to subsidize his stamp collection. The king's patronage of sport did not end with the settlement of a bookmaker's account. He was a sportsman in the now outmoded sense. He was a contestant, not merely an unathletic but bellicose spectator. At both yachting and shooting, he could outshine almost any man in his kingdom. Neither pursuit lent him to popular appeal. Yet his reported skill evoked interest and admiration even among the millions of his subjects who never harnessed a wind to sail or seen one high pheasant after another dispatched with effortless grace. Shooting remained his first love. But before the grouse lured him north, between Goodwood and Balmoral, he would spend an ecstatic week at Cowes. The Britannia had just passed us, the Queen wrote during one August, and I saw the king looking very wet and uncomfortable in his oilskins. What a way to enjoy oneself! Built in 1892 for the Prince of Wales, later he became King Edward, the cutter Britannia won 122 first prizes out of 289 in her first 5 years of racing. The prince then put to her on the market. Disgusted by the bullying behavior of the Kaiser, who looked on Cowes Week as an opportunity to humiliate his uncle. The regatta used to be a pleasant relaxation for me, the prince complained. Since the Kaiser takes command, it's a vexation. The yacht passed through various hands. The owner was John Lawson Johnston, the manufacturer of Bovril. Another was the financier E.T. Hooley, reputed to have abandoned his purchase on discovering she had no funnel. Hooley had earlier bought Anmer Hall, but was persuaded to resell it to the Prince of Wales. He also gave a service of gold communion plate to the St. Paul's Cathedral to mark the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. Eventually bought back by King Edward in 1902, Britannia was used as a pleasure boat for the next 11 years. In 1913, King George had it re-rigged as a racing cruiser, but it was not until after the war that she embarked on her second racing career. No less glorious than her first, I am indeed proud in owning such a good yacht of 39 years. He wrote in August 1932. 2 years later, he noted the Britannia had since 1893 sailed 569 races, winning 231 first prizes and 124 others. Sometimes he would take the helm himself, a distinctive figure in an old white flannel suit and sailor's hat without a peak. More often, he would relinquish it to the superior skills of his racing master, Sir Philip Hunloke. The king liked to win races, but he was also a good loser. Apparently immune to the seasickness which afflicted him in larger vessels, he enjoyed the chaff and the nautical gossip, the discomfiture of inferior boats and their crews, the utter release from affairs of state. He was every inch the image of a sailor king. Except on the calmest of days, the Queen never ventured on board, but would drive around the Isle of Wight inspecting churches, country houses, and antique shops. As the approach of the King's Silver Jubilee in 1935, the yachtsmen of England asked whether they would present him with a new boat. The King refused. "As long as I live," he replied, "I will never own another yacht other than the Britannia." Within the year that he was dead, on the early morning of 10 July 1936, the Britannia was towed into deep water south of Isle of Wight and sunk. And that is the end of Chapter 8, The Home Life. So I hope this turned out very well. The next chapter we will read about is on the political pressures of King George V. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you will tune in to as I finish reading this book, which you can find on thriftbook.com. And it's a very good read of a very important figure, King George V. He was a very good and dutiful king. Thank you for listening.